The groan of the rope was a thirsty sound. Eleanor Whitfield put her shoulder into the crank, her muscles straining against the dry, splintered wood. Below, in the dark stone throat of the well, the bucket scraped against the sides, a hollow echo that promised little when it finally surfaced, sloshing a pitifully small amount of water over its lip. Her heart sank with it. Less than a gallon. Not enough for the stock, barely enough for the house. The crank handle, cracked clean through, wobbled precariously in her hand. It was another thing her father had meant to fix. The list of things her father had meant to fix was as long and unforgiving as the Wyoming summer. Silver Gulch baked under the August sun of 1889, a collection of clapboard and brick huddled in a valley of scorched prairie grass. Dust was the currency of the town. It settled on every hat brim, coated every window, and lived in the back of every throat. The talk was of two things: the coming railroad and the deepening drought. The railroad promised fortunes, sending land prices soaring in whispers and backroom deals. The drought, however, was a loud, present threat, starving the ranches that clung to the edges of the arid land. Banks grew fat while cattle grew thin. Eleanor's ranch, Willow Bend, was caught in the middle of it all. Since her father's passing 2 months prior, the weight of it had settled squarely on her 22-year-old shoulders. She was a practical woman, raised not for parlors but for the saddle. She knew how to mend a fence, read a brand, and fire the Winchester rifle that leaned by her door, though she prayed she would only ever need it for coyotes. Her goal was simple: monumental hold onto the ranch, and with it, her dignity. To fail meant losing not just her home, but her father's legacy and her own name. She unhooked the bucket, the water inside already looking dull under a film of dust. A sudden snort and a frantic stomping sound from the corral pulled her attention. Her gelding, Jasper, was shying violently, his eyes wide and white. He bucked against the railing, his fear a palpable thing in the still, hot air. A calm voice drifted over from the fence line that separated Willow Bend from the neighboring Red Mesa ranch. He is just as contrary as an August afternoon. Eleanor turned to see Eli Mercer leaning against a fence post, his hat pushed back on his head. At 28, Eli moved with a quiet economy, a steadiness that seemed to defy the frantic energy of the world around him. He ran Red Mesa with a competence that men twice his age envied. Yet he carried a sorrow in his eyes that spoke of a past hurt. The whole territory knew he had lost his younger brother during a cattle raid years ago, a wound that had stolen his easy smile but left his kindness intact. "He is not contrary, he is spooked," Eleanor replied, her voice tight with frustration as she moved toward the corral. "Something has set him off." Eli pushed off the post and ambled over, his steps measured and unthreatening. He did not enter the corral, but rested his forearms on the top rail, his presence alone seeming to absorb some of the horse's panic. "Let me sweet-talk him a bit," he said, his voice a low murmur. Eleanor watched, her own tension easing slightly as Eli began to speak to Jasper. His words were nonsense, a gentle stream of observations about the weather and the heat. But the tone was a balm. The gelding's ears swiveled, his frantic movements slowed to a nervous shuffle, and finally, he stood, trembling but still. Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You are better at sweet-talking horses than people." A faint smile touched Eli's lips. "Horses are more honest. They tell you right away if they think you are a fool." He nodded toward the broken well crank. "Looks like you are fighting a losing battle there." "It will hold," she said, a touch too quickly. It was a point of pride. Admitting one failure felt like admitting them all. Eli did not press. He just watched her for a moment, his gaze taking in the weary set of her shoulders, the smudge of dirt on her cheek. "I have a spare cistern at the north pasture. The water is clean. You are welcome to it until the rains come." Eleanor's pride warred with her practicality. She needed the water desperately, But she hated the idea of being a charity case. The helpless woman rancher the town already pitied. "Send me a bill when the season turns," she said, her tone formal. "I will trade you for a few of those apple pies your father was so proud of," he countered gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. His offer was a bridge, not a handout. It allowed her to keep her dignity. She managed a small, grateful nod. "That seems fair." He tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Eleanor," he said, stopping after a few paces, "do not let this place dry you out." He gestured vaguely at the well, the parched fields, the vast, empty sky. His meaning was clear. He was not just talking about water. Later that day, Eleanor rode into Silver Gulch, the wagon behind her carrying a few hides she hoped to sell. The town was a cacophony of hammering from the new saloon being built and the raised voices of men arguing over land claims. She tied Jasper to the hitching post outside the mercantile, her mind on the list of necessities: salt, flour, and a new leather strap for the tack shed. Her first stop, however, was the small shop at the end of the main street with a neatly painted sign that read "May Carter, Seamstress, Inside." The air smelled of chalk and clean linen. May Carter, her friend since childhood, was bent over a sewing machine, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was a woman of sharp wit and sharper ambitions, her dreams reaching far beyond the dusty confines of Silver Gulch. "Eleanor, you look like you have been wrestling a dust devil," May said without looking up, the whir of the machine filling the silence. "It wrestled me back," Eleanor replied, sinking onto a small stool. May finally stopped, pushing a stray strand of blonde hair from her face. She looked at Eleanor's tired face, and her expression softened. "The ranch." "The well," Eleanor said. "It is nearly dry." Eli Mercer offered his cistern. May's eyebrows rose, the handsome, quiet one. "Be careful, or people will start talking." "Let them talk. I need the water." "Of course you do." May stood and stretched, her hands on her hips. She surveyed Eleanor's worn denim trousers and simple cotton shirt. "You need a new dress for the engagement party." Something to remind Thomas Reed what a prize he is getting. The engagement party. In the whirlwind of grief and worry, she had almost forgotten. She was to marry Thomas Reed, the clerk at the Silver Gulch Bank. He was handsome, polished, and presented a future of stability she desperately craved. He had promised to help her sort out the inheritance paperwork for Willow Bend, a confusing tangle of deeds and titles her father had left behind. "I do not have time to think about dresses." "May, you must make time. You are marrying the most respectable man in town. If you marry the banker, make sure you feed me well at the wedding." May's tone was teasing, but beneath it, Eleanor could hear the familiar yearning, the desire for a life of ease and comfort that seemed so far from her own. Eleanor left the dress shop with a promise to return for a fitting and headed for the bank. The building was the grandest in town, made of brick with tall windows that seemed to look down on the lesser wooden structures around it. Inside, it was cool and quiet. Thomas stood behind the counter, looking immaculate in a starched shirt and dark vest. His hair was perfectly parted, and his smile was a flash of white in the dim interior. "Eleanor, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. He came around the counter and took her hands, his touch soft and clean. "You should not be troubling yourself with town business." "You look exhausted." "I had hides to sell," she said, pulling her hands away gently, suddenly conscious of the grime under her fingernails. His smile did not falter. "Of course. You are so capable." He lowered his voice, leaning closer. "I have made progress with the paperwork. Your father's affairs were a bit disorganized, but nothing I cannot handle. I have spoken with Mr. Halverson, the bank president. We will have the deed transferred solely to your name in no time. You will be the official owner of Willow Bend." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. "Thank you. Thomas, I do not know what I would do without you." "It is my pleasure, and soon it will be my duty to look after you," he said, his eyes gleaming with an ambition that she mistook for affection. "Just a few more signatures will be needed after our engagement is formally announced. We will secure your future, our future." She left the bank feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The world seemed less hostile, the challenges more manageable. She had May, her clever and loyal friend. She had Thomas, her charming and capable fiancé who would untangle the legal knots that choked her inheritance. And she had Eli, her quiet, kind neighbor, who offered water without asking for anything but a pie in return. As she rode out of town, the setting sun painted the prairie in hues of orange and purple. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. She guided Jasper toward Willow Bend, unaware that the smooth words of a banker were far more dangerous than the threat of drought, and that the deepest cracks were not in the parched earth or a broken well crank, but in the fragile bonds of trust she held so dear. The well at Willow Bend was a symbol of her struggle, its low water a measure of her dwindling resources. But she was wrong to think the threat was only the lack of water. The true drought was one of honesty, and the thirstiest souls in Silver Gulch were not the ones seeking water, but the ones seeking power. And her ranch, her Willow Bend, was the oasis they all intended to claim. The porch of the Silver Gulch Community Church was transformed. Lanterns cast a warm, golden glow, chasing away the encroaching twilight and making the dust motes dance like tiny fairies. The air, usually thick with the scent of dry earth and livestock, was sweetened by dozens of apple pies lined up on a long trestle table. A fiddler, perched on an overturned barrel, sawed a lively tune that set toes tapping and drew reluctant smiles from even the most drought-hardened faces. The whole town, it seemed, had turned out to celebrate the engagement of Eleanor Whitfield and Thomas Reed, the promising couple, the perfect match. Eleanor stood beside Thomas, feeling the unfamiliar fabric of the dress May had insisted on making for her. It was a deep blue cotton, a shade darker than the evening sky, and it felt both restrictive and elegant after months spent in denim. She accepted the handshakes and well-wishes, the pats on the shoulder and the knowing glances from the town matriarchs. She was playing a part, the blushing bride-to-be, and she found it surprisingly easy. This was security. This was the future her father would have wanted for her. Thomas was in his element, his hand resting proprietarily on the small of her back. He greeted everyone by name, his smile effortless, his words perfectly chosen. He was the picture of prosperity and confidence. When he leaned down to whisper in her ear, his breath smelled faintly of peppermint. "See, my love," he murmured, "the entire town is celebrating our good fortune." He gestured to the crowd. "Soon, Willow Bend will be secure, and you will never have to worry about a thing again." She gave him a grateful smile. The paperwork, she asked quietly. The persistent worry, a small, hard knot in her stomach. He waved a dismissive hand. "As good as done. I have the transfer deed ready. Mr. Halverson and I have seen to everything. It just needs a few of your signatures. A mere formality we can handle after the festivities. Tonight is for us." His reassurance was a comforting weight, settling her nerves. She allowed him to lead her through the crowd, laughing at a joke from the blacksmith, politely deflecting a nosy question from the mercantile owner's wife. She felt a surge of genuine affection for him, for this man who was steering her through the treacherous waters of her grief and inheritance. She excused herself to get a cup of lemonade, needing a moment away from the crush of people. As she stood by the table, she saw Mr. Halverson, the bank president, talking to Thomas near the corner of the porch. Halverson was a stout man with a permanently sour expression, and he was not smiling now. He spoke in a low, gruff voice, and Eleanor, shielded by the noise of the party, caught a few distinct phrases. "Get it signed before the railroad survey is made public." Thomas's reply was a smooth, placating murmur, but Halverson cut him off. "I do not care about her feelings. Read, the foreclosure clause your father wrote into her old man's loan is ironclad. We can get the land for a steal. Just make sure her signature is on that deed transfer tonight. Eleanor froze, the tin cup halfway to her lips. Foreclosure clause. A steal, the words made no sense. Thomas had said he was protecting her, securing her inheritance. Why would the bank president be talking about buying her land cheaply? A cold dread, heavy and numbing, began to seep into her veins, chilling her far more than the evening air. She put the cup down, her hand trembling slightly. She had to be mistaken. She must have misheard. She looked for Thomas, but he and Halverson had moved off the porch, disappearing into the shadows around the side of the church. She felt a sudden, desperate need for air, for a quiet place to clear her head. She slipped away from the party, her blue dress a whisper of movement in the darkness. The fiddle music faded behind her, replaced by the chirping of crickets. She rounded the back of the church, her eyes adjusting to the deep shadows. The small, squat structure of the coal shed stood nearby, its door slightly ajar. A low, feminine sob drifted out, followed by the sound of a man's urgent whisper. The voice was Thomas's. The sob was horribly, sickeningly familiar. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved closer, silent as a ghost, every muscle in her body tensed. She peered through the gap in the door. In the sliver of moonlight that cut through the darkness, she saw them. Thomas had May pressed against the rough wooden wall, their forms tangled together. May's shoulders were shaking with silent sobs, her face buried in his chest. "You promised." May wept, her voice muffled. "You promised. When we have our land, you promised we could leave." "Hush," Thomas whispered, his voice no longer smooth but sharp, angry. "It is almost done. Do not ruin it now. She will sign the papers, and the ranch will be ours. Halverson will pay us handsomely once the railroad buys the property. Then you will have your dress shop in Cheyenne. I promise. Just be quiet." The world tilted on its axis. The solid ground beneath Eleanor's feet seemed to dissolve into dust. Her friend, her fiancé. The promise was not of love, but of land. Her land. She was not a bride-to-be. She was a mark, a pawn in a scheme so cruel, so intimately treacherous, that her mind could barely comprehend it. She must have made a sound, a choked gasp, because Thomas's head snapped up. His eyes widened in the gloom as he saw her silhouette in the doorway. He pushed May away from him roughly. "Eleanor," he began, taking a step forward. "This is not what it looks like." She said nothing. She simply stared, her face a pale, emotionless mask. All the warmth had drained out of the world, leaving only a vast, cold emptiness. May stumbled out of the shed, her face streaked with tears and coal dust. She reached for Eleanor, her hands pleading. "Eleanor, please, do not ruin my life. Please, you have to understand." Eleanor looked at the woman who had been her friend since they were girls, the woman who had just fitted her for a new dress while secretly plotting to steal her home. A strange, terrifying calm settled over her. "You already did that to me," she said, her voice flat and dead. She turned and walked back toward the light of the party, leaving them standing in the shadows. She moved like a sleepwalker, each step an effort of will. As she emerged onto the porch, the fiddler was just finishing a song. The music stopped. All eyes turned to her. They saw her face, white as bone. They saw Thomas and May emerging from the darkness behind her, their expressions a mixture of guilt and panic. The whispers started instantly, a rustle of speculation that spread through the crowd like wildfire. A woman near the steps, one of the town's most notorious gossips, leaned toward her neighbor and muttered, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear. Betrayed by her fiancé and her best friend. She shook her head with a kind of grim satisfaction. "Well, I reckon the cowboy next door loved her anyway. I would bet on it." The words barely registered. Eleanor walked straight to the table where the engagement announcement, a simple, hand-lettered card, was displayed. She picked it up, and with deliberate, steady hands, she tore it in half, then in quarters, letting the pieces fall to the dusty porch boards. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thomas started toward her, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "Eleanor, do not be a fool," he hissed. She did not even look at him. She turned and walked down the steps, moving with a purpose she did not feel. She untied Jasper from the hitching post, her movement stiff and automatic. She swung herself into the saddle and urged the horse into a canter, then a gallop, fleeing the suffocating light of the party for the cold, honest dark of the prairie. She rode without thinking, letting the wind tear at her hair and whip the tears from her eyes. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to get away. From the edge of the celebration, Eli Mercer had watched the entire drama unfold. He had seen Eleanor's face when she returned to the porch, had seen the life drain out of it. He saw her tear the card, and he saw her ride away as if the devil himself were on her heels. Without a word to anyone, he moved to his own horse, saddled and waiting. He swung aboard and set off at a steady trot, keeping a respectful distance, a silent, watchful shadow against the moonlit hills. He would not intrude on her grief, but he would not let her ride into the unforgiving night alone. Back at the church, as the crowd dispersed in a flurry of shocked murmurs, Thomas Reed found Mr. Halverson. The banker's face was livid. "You idiot," Halverson snarled. "I told you to be careful." "She will come around," Thomas said, his voice strained. "She has no choice. I have the deed transfer right here. The signature looks perfect. We file it at first light. We will push it through before she can find a lawyer. The railroad is not waiting for a jilted lover to compose herself." Eleanor finally let Jasper slow to a walk when the lights of Silver Gulch were nothing but a faint glimmer behind her. She reached the gate of Willow Bend, the familiar creak of the wood a lonely sound in the vast silence. She slid from the saddle, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. Hanging on the gatepost was a folded woolen shawl, its dark plaid a patch of warmth against the weathered wood. Tucked into its folds was a canteen, full and heavy. Beneath it, a small piece of paper was held in place by a stone. She picked it up. In a simple, strong hand, the note read, "Do not let them dry you out like the well." The simple kindness, so unexpected after such a profound betrayal, was what finally broke her. She leaned against the gate, the shawl clutched in her hands, and wept. The tears were not for Thomas or May, but for the loss of her own innocence. The humiliation was a physical pain, a hot brand on her soul. Anger followed, a clean, white, hot rage that burned away the tears. She stood up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She was alone. She was in danger, but she was not broken. "They can take my trust," she thought, her jaw tightening with resolve. "They can try to take my land, but they cannot buy my self-respect. That is not for sale." Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a harsh, brassy light that offered no relief from the heat. Eleanor did not wake with sorrow. The grief had been burned out of her, cauterized by the white-hot fury of betrayal. In its place was a cold, clear resolve. She rose, dressed in her father's old denim trousers, and walked out into the pale morning. Willow Bend, her home, now felt like a battlefield, and she was its sole defender. She spent the entire day in a methodical, relentless inventory of her situation. She walked every fence line, her gloved hands testing the posts, noting the sections that were rotted or leaning. She counted her cattle, their ribs showing starkly beneath their hides, their movements listless in the oppressive heat. She inspected the hay barn, the remaining bales few and dusty, the scent of scarcity hanging in the air. The grass in the pastures was brittle and yellow, crunching under her boots like glass, Every broken hinge, every leaky trough, every patch of bare earth was a new enemy to be faced. She worked alone, the silence broken only by the cawing of crows and the lowing of her hungry animals. This was her inheritance, not just the land, but the struggle to keep it. Late in the afternoon, as she was attempting to reinforce a sagging corral gate with a piece of salvaged wire, Eli Mercer rode up, not on his usual steady gelding, but leading a sturdy pack mule. The mule was loaded with 2 large, sealed water barrels. He stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to spook her while she worked. "I thought I would save you the trip," he said, his voice calm as ever. Eleanor straightened up, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. She looked at the barrels, then at him. Her pride was a stubborn, thorny thing, but her pragmatism was stronger. The stock needed water, and she could not pull enough from the dying well. "I told you I would pay," she said, her voice firm. He swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and easy. "And I told you I would take payment in apple pies." He smiled, a faint but genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Seems a fair trade. Water for sweets." She hesitated for a second longer, then gave a curt nod. She could not afford to let pride kill her ranch. "Bring them over to the main trough." As they worked to empty the barrels, a comfortable silence fell between them. It was the silence of shared labor, not of awkwardness. He did not ask about the engagement party, did not offer a word of pity. He simply worked alongside her, his presence a quiet statement of support that meant more than any spoken condolence. The next morning, she rode into Silver Gulch for supplies. The town felt different. The stares were more pointed, the whispers less concealed. She walked into the mercantile, her back straight, her chin held high, and felt the conversations halt, then resume in a lower, more urgent key. A woman in a calico dress muttered to her friend, "A single woman cannot possibly manage a ranch of that size. She will lose it before the first snow." Eleanor pretended not to hear, placing her order with a cool efficiency that dared anyone to challenge her. On her way out, she nearly ran into Reverend Michael, the town's pastor. He was a kind man with a gentle face, but his eyes held the weight of his convictions. He placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. "Eleanor, my child," he said, his voice soft with concern. "I was so sorry to hear of the unpleasantness." "Thank you, Reverend," she said, trying to move past him. He held her arm gently. "The good book teaches us the power of forgiveness, perhaps in time. You can find it in your heart to forgive young Thomas. A good woman's virtue is in her gentle spirit." His words, meant to soothe, felt like sandpaper on a raw wound. Was it her duty to forgive the man who tried to steal her home and her dignity? Was her only virtue in being gentle? The unspoken message was clear: she should smooth things over, accept a lesser deal, and find a husband to take charge. That was the proper path for a woman alone. "My spirit is not feeling particularly gentle right now, Reverend," she replied, her voice dangerously quiet, "but I appreciate your prayers." She pulled her arm free and walked away, his well-meaning prejudice fanning the flames of her resolve. The first real crisis came a few days later. A sudden downpour, the first in weeks, was a blessing that quickly turned into a curse. The hard, baked earth could not absorb the water, which instead carved new gullies into the dry soil. One of her best breeding cows, spooked by the thunder, stumbled and fell into a freshly eroded ditch, its sides a slick, impassable wall of mud. Eleanor found the animal bellowing in panic, its legs trapped at an awkward angle. She tried for hours to get a rope around it, to give it purchase, but the mud was a greedy, sucking trap. Exhausted and desperate, she finally did the one thing she had sworn she would not do. She rode to Red Mesa. Eli was in his barn, mending a harness by lantern light. He listened to her story without interruption, his expression serious. He simply nodded, extinguished the lantern, and saddled his strongest horse. They worked through the night. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a black, starless canvas. The only light came from their 2 lanterns, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and the panicked sweat of the trapped cow. They dug with shovels, their muscles screaming in protest, trying to create a ramp out of the muck. They looped ropes around the heaving animal, pulling in unison until their hands were raw and blistered. Mud caked their clothes, their faces, their hair. It was brutal, exhausting, filthy work. Sometime before dawn, with one final, coordinated heave, the cow scrambled free, its legs trembling as it found solid ground. It stood for a moment, dazed, then trotted off to rejoin the herd. Eleanor and Eli stood in the muddy ditch, leaning on their shovels, too tired to speak. They were covered head to toe in mud, their faces almost unrecognizable. In the faint, pre-dawn light, she looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face, and a new kind of trust began to form within her, a trust forged not in words or promises, but in shared sweat and struggle. He had helped her, and he had not once said, "I told you so." The incident with the cow was a victory, but it was followed by a more sinister threat. A few nights later, she was woken by the nervous whinnying of her horse. She took her Winchester from its place by the door and peered out into the moonlit yard. For a moment, she saw a shadow detach itself from the fence line at the far end of the pasture, a figure on horseback, before it melted back into the darkness. The next morning she found strange hoof prints near the fence, the tracks of a shod horse that was not hers, rustlers. They were watching her, testing her defenses, waiting for a moment of weakness. 2 days later, Thomas Reed rode into her yard. He looked as immaculate as ever, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the dust and disrepair of her ranch. He dismounted and approached her as if nothing had happened, his smile polished and confident. "Eleanor," he said, his tone reasonable, as if speaking to a difficult child, "this foolishness has gone on long enough. I am prepared to overlook your public display. We can still be married." She looked at him, at his handsome face, and felt nothing but a cold, hard anger. He continued, misinterpreting her silence. "I will even be generous. I will take on the ranch's debt personally. All you have to do is sign the property over to my name, as a formality for the bank, and we can put this all behind us." She finally found her voice. "I will not sign my name to my own disgrace. Thomas, now get off my land." His smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. "You are a fool. You cannot manage this place. The bank will take it, one way or another. You will be left with nothing." "I will have my name," she said, "which is more than I can say for you." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold with fury. "You will regret this," he spat, before turning on his heel, mounting his horse, and riding away in a cloud of dust. His visit was followed by another, this one far more difficult. May Carter came to her door that evening, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She stood on the porch, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "Eleanor, please," she began, her voice a broken whisper. "I am so sorry." Eleanor just looked at her, her expression unreadable. "He promised me everything," May sobbed. "A shop of my own in Cheyenne, a new life. I was so tired of being poor, of mending other people's clothes while mine were in rags. I never meant to hurt you." Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then she turned, went back inside the small cabin, and returned a moment later. She held out her hand. In her palm lay a needle and a spool of thread. "You can patch a torn seam, May," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "But some fabrics cannot be mended once they are torn. Trust is one of them." May stared at the needle and thread, then at Eleanor's unforgiving face. The tears came again, hopeless and desperate. She turned and fled, her sobs echoing in the quiet evening. The next blow came not from a person, but from a piece of paper. A rider from the bank delivered an official-looking envelope. Inside was a notice of foreclosure. Citing an old mortgage her father had taken out years ago, the bank was calling in the loan. She had 30 days to pay the full amount, an impossible sum, or Willow Bend would be seized and auctioned. The document was signed by Mr. Halvorson and witnessed by Thomas Reed. The scheme was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was now a legal, undeniable threat. That evening, Eli found her by the well, staring down into its dark, dry throat. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply came and stood beside her. "They are trying to take it," she said, her voice hollow. "The bank. I have 30 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 30 days is a long time." He pointed to a small, almost invisible trickle of water seeping from a fissure in the rock at the bottom of the well. "See that the underground spring has not given up yet. We just have to help it along." Over the next week, he taught her. He showed her how to read the land, to find the low points where water might gather. He helped her dig a series of small diversion channels to catch any runoff. They worked together to patch the leaks in her troughs, saving every precious drop. He taught her how to rotate her cattle to the small patches of surviving grass, conserving the resource with a patience and wisdom that came from a lifetime spent listening to the land. He was not solving her problems for her. He was giving her the tools to solve them herself. And slowly, miraculously, the water level in the well began to rise, inch by painful inch. One evening, as they finished a long day of moving a section of fence, the sky, which had been a relentless, empty blue for months, began to fill with gray clouds. A cool breeze whispered through the dry grass. A single drop of rain hit the dust at Eleanor's feet. Then another, and another. Soon, a gentle, steady shower was falling, washing the dust from the air, from the leaves of the cottonwood trees, from her tired face. She tilted her head back, closing her eyes and letting the cool water run down her cheeks, mingling with the tears of relief she could no longer hold back. A real smile, the first she had felt in weeks, spread across her lips. Eli stood beside her, a grin on his own face. "See," he said, his voice full of a quiet humor, "even the heavens are on your side." The rain was not a solution. It would not pay the bank or stop the rustlers. But it was hope. A small, clean, life-giving sign that even in the driest, most desperate of times, renewal was possible. The memory surfaced in the dead of night, a splinter working its way out of her mind. Eleanor sat bolt upright in her bed, the image of a piece of paper suddenly sharp and clear in her thoughts. It was the deed transfer Thomas had flashed at her, the one he said was a mere formality. At the time, she had only felt relief, but now, she remembered the bank's official seal embossed in the corner. The eagle. There was something wrong with the eagle. Its left wing had been less detailed, the feathers not as distinct as the one on the foreclosure notice that now sat on her mantelpiece. She brought it up with Eli the next morning as he helped her reset a fence post. She described the discrepancy, feeling foolish as she said it aloud. "It is probably nothing, just a smudge of ink." Eli drove the post into the ground with a heavy mallet, his movements deliberate. "Or it is a different stamp," he said, not looking at her. "Banks change their official seals now and then, but they always record the date of the change. And they do not use an old one and a new one at the same time." He wiped his hands on his trousers. "The circuit lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, is due in Silver Gulch next week. A good lawyer knows the difference between a smudge and a forgery." The idea of a lawyer felt like an admission of defeat, another expense she could not afford. But the image of that flawed eagle would not leave her. She nodded slowly. "I will see him." The rustler's next visit was not a warning. It was an attack. She woke one morning to a stillness that felt wrong, a missing sound in the usual chorus of the ranch. She went to the small pasture where she kept her new calves and found the gate swinging open, the leather latch neatly sliced through. 2 of her best calves were gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. That was her future, the very seed of her herd's recovery, stolen in the night. She searched the area, her eyes scanning the ground for tracks. Beside the sliced gate, half trampled into the dust, lay a black felt hat, its brim stained with sweat. She picked it up. Burned into the side of the hat was a brand she had only heard of in hushed, fearful whispers. 2 overlapping hooks, forming a crooked, menacing shape. The Double Hook Gang. When she showed the hat to Eli, his face went hard. The usual calm in his eyes replaced by a glacial stillness. All the warmth left him, and what remained was cold, dangerous memory. He took the hat from her, his knuckles white as he gripped the brim. "This was them," he said, his voice a low growl. "The ones who—" He did not need to finish the sentence. "The ones who had killed his brother." The raid had not just been about cattle. It had been a senseless act of violence that had scarred him forever. Whispers had long circulated in the saloons and back alleys of Silver Gulch, rumors that connected the respectable men of business with the violent men of the plains. They said that Thomas Reed and Mr. Halvorson had an arrangement with the Double Hook Gang, a dark partnership where the bank looked the other way on certain loans in exchange for protection and enforcement. The rustlers were not just random thieves. They were a weapon, used to pressure ranchers, to drive them off their land so the bank could acquire it cheaply. Until now, it had been just a rumor. Now, with this hat in her neighbor's hand, the rumor felt like a cold, hard fact. In town, May Carter's conscience was beginning to fray. She saw Thomas not as a charming suitor anymore, but as a man whose ambition had curdled into cruelty. He had what he wanted, a signed deed. Yet he continued to torment Eleanor with foreclosure notices and rustlers. "This was not what you said," she confronted him one evening in the back room of her shop. "You said you would secure the land. You did not say you would terrorize her." Thomas barely looked at her. His attention focused on counting a small stack of bills. "Business is business. May, she is being stubborn. She needs to be encouraged to leave. This is wrong." His head snapped up, his eyes cold and devoid of any affection he might have once feigned. "Be careful," he warned, his voice dangerously soft. "You are a part of this now. If you say a word, you will not get a dress shop in Cheyenne. You will get a jail cell right here in Silver Gulch for conspiracy and fraud, and you will still be nothing but a poor seamstress when you get out." He pocketed the money and walked to the door. "Remember that." Eleanor, desperate for capital to buy winter feed and hire a lawyer, took a wagon load of cured hides to the weekly market in town. She haggled hard, her voice steady despite the gnawing anxiety in her gut. She secured a decent price and went straight to the seed merchant, her small pouch of coins feeling pitifully light in her hand. As she was counting out the payment for a sack of hardy winter rye, a familiar, hated voice spoke from behind her. "Allow me." Thomas Reed stood there, holding out a handful of coins to the merchant. He was smiling his public smile, the gallant gentleman coming to the aid of a lady in distress. The entire market seemed to be watching. Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face. She pushed his hand away, the coin scattering in the dust. "I pay with money," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "Not with my life." She turned back to the merchant, counted out her own coins with deliberate care, and hefted the sack of seed onto her shoulder. She walked away without a backward glance, leaving Thomas standing amidst the scattered coins and the silent judgment of the crowd. The drought, which had briefly eased, returned with a vengeance. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, and the wind began to whip across the prairie, picking up the loose topsoil. A dust storm. Eleanor saw the roiling wall of brown on the horizon and knew she had to move her herd to the sheltered box canyon on the western edge of her property. As she struggled to gather the panicked animals, Eli appeared, driving his own herd before him. The wind was a physical force now, screaming in their ears and stinging their eyes with sand. "We will mix them," he shouted over the gale. The canyon is our only chance." They worked in a desperate, frantic symphony of instinct and skill. They rode through the blinding dust, their bandanas pulled up over their faces, their voices raw from shouting. The cattle, terrified by the storm, were a chaotic, surging mass, but together. Eleanor and Eli managed to funnel them toward the narrow canyon entrance. They spent hours in the swirling brown darkness, their bodies pushed to the limits of exhaustion. When the last of the cattle were safely inside the canyon's protective rock walls, the storm was at its peak. They dismounted, slumping against a rock face, too tired to speak. The world was a maelstrom of wind and dirt. Eli took off his heavy canvas coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of leather and clean sweat. She pulled it tighter around her, shivering not from cold but from exhaustion and a strange, unfamiliar sense of gratitude. "Do not learn the habit of those showy cowboys," she managed to say, her voice hoarse, displaying their chests for all the world to see. He gave a tired smile, his face barely visible in the gloom. "My chest is not on display, only my kindness." The moment was a small island of peace in the heart of the storm. They sat in silence, the wind howling around them, their shoulders occasionally brushing. In the shared struggle for survival, the barriers of pride and propriety had been stripped away, leaving only two people finding shelter together. When Eleanor finally met with Mr. Abernathy, the circuit lawyer, he was a thin, balding man with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She told him everything, from the night of the engagement party to the flawed eagle on the deed. He listened patiently, making meticulous notes. He took the foreclosure notice and examined the bank seal with a small magnifying glass. Then he took the copy of the transfer deed Thomas had filed at the land office. "This is a forgery," he said simply, pointing to the seal on the deed. "A clumsy one. At that, but proving it will be difficult. It will be your word against a bank president's—" Eleanor's heart sank. Then Abernathy's eyes narrowed as he scanned the fine print of her father's original mortgage agreement, the one the foreclosure was based on. His finger stopped on a single, dense paragraph. "Well, now," he murmured, "this is interesting." "What is it?" "This, Miss Whitfield, is what is known as a railroad indemnity clause. It stipulates that if the land is sold or transferred within 60 days of a new railroad right-of-way being announced, the purchaser is entitled to a compensation payment from the territorial government at 3 times the property's assessed value. He looked at her over the top of his spectacles. The Trans-Wyoming Railroad is due to announce its new spur line any day now, and the preliminary surveys show it cutting directly through your northern pasture. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The stolen calves, the foreclosure, the forged signature, the desperate urgency. It was not just about stealing her land. It was about cashing in on a massive government payout. They were not just trying to rob her of her home. They were trying to use her as a pawn to defraud the entire territory. She had not just been betrayed by a lover. She had been sold for the price of a railroad. She told Eli that night, the words tumbling out of her in a rush of angry revelation. He listened, his face grim, the hat with the double-hook brand sitting on the table between them like a loaded gun. When she was finished, he stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark silhouette of the prairie. "I lost my brother to those men," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a terrible weight. "They took him for a handful of cattle. I watched my family break apart from the grief of it." He turned to face her, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "I will not let them take anything else from you." The air grew heavy and thick, charged with a strange, electrical tension. The sky to the west was a bruised purple, flickering with silent, heat-driven lightning. There was no thunder, no promise of rain, only the dry, dangerous crackle of static in the atmosphere. Every rancher in the territory knew the signs. This was fire weather. A single spark, a stray bolt of lightning striking the tinderbox prairie, could unleash an inferno that would consume everything in its path. Sleep was impossible for Eleanor. She sat on her porch steps, the Winchester rifle resting across her knees, her eyes scanning the dark horizon for the first telltale orange glow of a fire. Every gust of wind sounded like a roar, every rustle of the dry leaves like the hiss of flames. The entire region was holding its breath, united in a collective prayer for rain that did not come. Across the fence line, she could see a single lantern burning by the massive haystack at Red Mesa. Eli was keeping watch, too. His entire winter feed, his livelihood, was in that stack. Sometime after midnight, the tension became unbearable. She could not just sit and wait. She stood up, her movements stiff, and walked toward the barn. The smell of hay and animals was a comfort, a tangible reality in a night filled with imagined horrors. She checked on Jasper, who shifted restlessly in his stall, his ears twitching at the charged air. A quiet footstep behind her made her spin around, her hand instinctively going to the rifle. "It is just me," Eli said, his voice a low murmur from the doorway. He was not holding a lantern, but his form was clear in the flickering light of the distant lightning. "I saw you were still awake. Thought you might want some company." She relaxed her grip on the rifle. "Thought you would be guarding your haystack." "I am," he said, stepping into the barn. "From here, I can see it just as well, and my own thoughts were poor company tonight." He joined her by Jasper's stall, leaning against the rough wood. They stood in silence for a while, watching the lightning paint the sky in brief, ghostly flashes. The air inside the barn was warm and close, smelling of dry hay and the sweet breath of the horse. "My father used to hate nights like this," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He would say the sky was making threats it had no intention of keeping, all flash and no substance. Eli nodded. "My younger brother, Sam, he loved them. He would stand outside and dare the lightning to strike him. He was not afraid of anything." He looked down at his hands, his knuckles showing white as he gripped the top of the stall door. That was the problem. He was not afraid of the Double Hook gang either. He thought he could face them down. Just a boy trying to protect our herd. The story came out of him in quiet, clipped sentences, the pain as raw as if it had happened yesterday instead of 5 years ago. He spoke of finding his brother, of the senselessness of the loss, of how the light seemed to go out of his family that day. He did not speak with self-pity, but with a profound, aching sorrow. When he finished, the silence in the barn was heavy with his grief. "My father," Eleanor said, finding her own voice in the darkness. "He taught me one thing above all else. He said, 'Eleanor, this land will try to break you. Men will try to buy you. Do not ever sell yourself cheap to survive.' He made some bad deals with the bank because he was desperate, but he never sold his honor. That is what Thomas and Halverson do not understand. They think this is about money and deeds, but it is about that, not selling your honor." She had shared a part of her own wound, her own creed, and in the shared darkness of the barn, their two separate griefs seemed to meet and acknowledge each other. The air was no longer just charged with lightning. It was charged with an unspoken understanding, a connection forged in loss and resilience. A soft pattering sound began on the tin roof of the barn. Faint at first, then stronger. Rain. Not a deluge, but a gentle, steady shower. The prayer of the prairie had been answered. The threat of fire was over. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over Eleanor. She turned her face toward the open barn door, a genuine, unguarded smile spreading across her features. Eli had turned too, and in the next flash of lightning, she saw his face, his expression mirroring her own relief. He was standing closer than she had realized. He reached up, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and brushed a piece of straw from her cheek. His touch lingered for a second longer than necessary. The air between them grew thick, the sound of the rain on the roof a soft, insistent drumbeat. He did not move away. His eyes, dark and serious in the dim light, held hers. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, to stop him. She did not. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild, unfamiliar fluttering in her chest. His lips met hers. The kiss was not demanding or passionate, but slow and deep and incredibly gentle. It tasted of the rain and the dust and the long, hard days they had shared. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of shared sorrow and silent strength. It was the most honest thing she had ever felt. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm on her skin. "I do not need anything of yours, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Not your land, not your name, just you." The simple, unadorned declaration undid her completely. The walls she had built so carefully around her heart began to crumble. Tremors ran through her, a mixture of fear and a hope she had not dared to feel. "I was betrayed," she heard herself say, the words a raw, shaky confession, "by my fiancé and my best friend." He did not flinch from her pain. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. The cowboy next door loved her anyway. He replied, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. The words, the ones she had heard the town gossip speak with such casual cruelty, were transformed. In his mouth, they were not an epitaph for a pathetic, jilted woman. They were a vow, a statement of fact that defied all the betrayal and the hurt. The intensity of the moment, of the feelings he had unlocked in her, was too much. She felt a flicker of panic, the old instinct to retreat, to protect herself from being hurt again. She tensed, a barely perceptible shift in her posture. He felt it immediately. He stepped back, putting a small, respectful distance between them. He did not look hurt or offended, only understanding. "We will go slow," he said, his voice gentle. "I will not take anything you are not ready to give. The rain is letting up. I should get back." He gave her a small, almost shy smile, tipped a hat he was not wearing, and slipped out of the barn, disappearing into the newly washed darkness. The next morning, the world felt new. The air was clean and cool. The dust settled, the colors of the prairie more vibrant. When Eleanor walked outside, the first thing she saw was Eli. Not at his own ranch, but at her fence line, methodically replacing a rotten post. He was not making a show of it. He was just working. A silent, steady presence. Her cattle, which had been nervous and agitated for weeks, were grazing peacefully nearby, their movements calm and unhurried. One of her older, more experienced hired hands, a man named Jedediah, who had worked for her father, rode past and tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Eleanor," he said, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face. Funny thing, even the cows seemed to be able to smell happiness. Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she smiled back. It was a good morning. From the window of her small shop in town, May Carter saw them. She had ridden out early, driven by a desperate need to apologize again, to explain, to somehow undo the damage she had done. But she stopped at the edge of the road, hidden by a stand of cottonwoods. She saw Eleanor bring a cup of coffee out to Eli. She saw the easy way they stood together, not touching, but connected by an invisible thread. She saw the genuine smile on Eleanor's face, a smile she had not seen in months, an agonizing mixture of jealousy and regret twisted in her gut. She had made her choice, had gambled on a future of silk dresses and Cheyenne storefronts, and she had lost everything that mattered. She turned her horse around and rode back to town, her heart as empty and desolate as the prairie after a fire. Eleanor, however, felt a shift inside herself, a fundamental change in her own landscape. The encounter in the barn had not just been a kiss, it had been a turning point. She had been reacting, surviving, holding on by her fingertips. Now, something new had taken root. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She walked to the well, the wood of the crank handle dark and damp from the rain. She lowered the bucket, and when she began to pull it up, it felt heavier, more resistant. It was not her imagination. When the bucket surfaced, it was nearly full, the water clear and deep. She heard it slosh against the sides, a sound of life, of replenishment. A slow, determined smile touched her lips. She looked out at her land, at Willow Bend. It was still threatened. The foreclosure notice still sat on her mantelpiece. The Double Hook gang was still out there. But she was no longer afraid. The fear had been replaced by a cold, hard purpose. "They can buy the land," she said to the quiet morning, "but they cannot buy my voice." The pace of her own heart had changed. The slow, defensive rhythm was gone. A new, quicker, more assertive beat had taken its place. It was time to stop patching fences and start hunting for evidence. It was time to fight back. Eleanor walked into the Silver Gulch Bank with Mr. Abernathy at her side. The cool, still air, a stark contrast to the determined heat in her veins. The polished wood and gleaming brass seemed to mock her with their air of untouchable legitimacy. Mr. Halverson looked up from his desk, his expression souring as he recognized them. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "We are here to inspect the official register of land transfers, Mr. Abernathy announced, his voice polite but firm, carrying across the quiet space. "My client, Miss Whitfield, has reason to believe a fraudulent document concerning her property has been filed." Halverson's eyes narrowed to small, piggy slits. "The bank's registers are private documents. I cannot allow you to rifle through them on a baseless accusation." "It is not a request," Abernathy said calmly. "It is a legal demand. Refusal to comply will be noted in my petition to the circuit judge." Halverson stalled, blustering about procedure and bank policy, his face growing redder by the minute. He was playing for time. As the argument continued, Eli Mercer walked in, his spurs making a soft, jingling sound on the marble floor. He went to the teller's cage, ignoring the confrontation completely. "I am here to make a deposit," Eli said to the nervous young clerk. He pushed a small pouch of coins across the counter. "And I will need a receipt, dated and stamped with the bank's official seal, if you please." The clerk, flustered, fumbled with the stamp and ink pad, pressing the new, intricate eagle seal firmly onto the receipt. Eli took the paper, glanced at it, and then turned. He walked over to Abernathy and handed it to him. "I believe you will find this useful for establishing a timeline," he said, his voice loud enough for Halverson to hear. "It confirms which seal the bank is officially using as of today." Abernathy took the receipt and smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Indeed, it is most helpful." Halverson's face went pale. He had been caught in a lie, and he knew it. The fake receipt was a brilliant legal maneuver, a small, undeniable piece of truth that exposed the larger fraud. The bank president sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking like a much older, more vulnerable man. In her small shop, May Carter was living in her own private jail cell of guilt and fear. Thomas had come to her, not with words of love, but with a train ticket to Denver and a threat. The ticket was a tangible promise of the future she had craved, a one-way passage out of her life of poverty. But the threat was a masterpiece of cruelty. It was a letter, written on her own stationery, in a flawless imitation of her handwriting. It was a supposed confession, detailing a fabricated plot where Eleanor had conspired with May to forge the deed herself in order to swindle the bank. "This is your insurance," Thomas had told her, his voice a venomous whisper. "If you speak a word against me, this letter will find its way to the sheriff. Your word against a signed confession. Who do you think they will believe?" She was trapped. To save herself, she had to remain silent and watch Eleanor be destroyed. To save Eleanor, she had to destroy herself. Thomas was no longer the charming man who had promised her a new life. He was a monster who had forged not just a deed, but a chain to bind her to his crimes. The social pressure on Eleanor was more subtle but just as insidious. The ladies of the church auxiliary committee paid her a visit, their face a mixture of pity and disapproval. They brought a sponge cake and a heavy dose of unsolicited advice. "Dear Eleanor," began the wife of the mercantile owner, a woman whose piety was matched only by her love of gossip. "We are all so worried about you. This business with the bank. It is not proper for a young woman to be making such a fuss. You must not cause a major disturbance," another added, her knitting needles clicking like tiny, judgmental insects. "A woman's place is to be a peacemaker." Eleanor listened, her hands folded calmly in her lap. When they had finished, she looked each of them in the eye. "Thank you for the cake, ladies," she said, her voice even and clear. "But you are mistaken. Seeking justice is not a sin." She stood up, signaling the end of the visit, leaving them sputtering in a cloud of their own offended propriety. Abernathy, armed with Eli's receipt, had his confirmation. He found the copy of the forged deed in the county records. As he suspected, the date of the transfer was a full week before the bank had officially changed its seal. It was impossible for the old, less detailed eagle to have been used on that date. It was the legal nail in their coffin. "We have them on the forgery," he told Eleanor and Eli in the parlor of her small cabin. "But Halverson and Reed will claim it was a clerical error. It is still your word against theirs about the larger conspiracy. We need something more. We need to connect them to the rustlers." That night, Eli went to the saloon. He wore an old, trail-worn duster and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He bought a bottle of cheap whiskey and took a table in a dark corner, looking for all the world like another down on his luck cow hand. He nursed his drink for hours, listening to the drunken boasts and complaints around him. Just after midnight, 2 men from the Double Hook gang came in. They were loud and arrogant, their faces flushed with cheap liquor. They sat at the bar, and Eli, straining his ears over the noise of the tinny piano, caught fragments of their conversation. "Halverson's getting nervous. Reed says to push the girl harder. Next week, during the new moon." One of the men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We will drive her whole herd into Red Canyon. Make it look like they just wandered off and got lost. By the time she finds them, if she finds them, she will be too broke to fight." Eli paid for his drink and left, melting into the darkness. He now had the what, the when, and the where. The net was tightening. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle came from the most unlikely of sources. 2 days later, Eleanor was in the mercantile when May Carter entered. May would not look at her, her face pale and drawn. As May passed by the counter where Eleanor was standing, she stumbled, dropping her reticule, its contents, a jumble of threads, thimbles, and coins, scattered across the floor. "Oh, clumsy me," May murmured, her voice shaking. As they both bent to pick up the items, their hands brushed. In that brief moment, May pressed a small, leather-bound notebook into Eleanor's hand. It was no bigger than a bar of soap. May's eyes, full of a desperate, pleading anguish, met Eleanor's for a single, fleeting second. Then she stood, gathered the rest of her things, and fled the store without another word. Eleanor clutched the small book in her hand. Later, in the privacy of her cabin, she opened it. Inside, in Thomas's neat, precise script, was a ledger. It was a meticulous record of his secret expenses. There were entries for lubrication, paid to certain county officials. There were payments for security to the leader of the Double Hook gang. It was the golden evidence, a complete accounting of his corruption. May, in an act of desperate courage, had given Eleanor the weapon she needed to destroy him, and by extension, herself. That evening, Eleanor showed the ledger to Eli. He whistled, a low, soft sound of appreciation. "If you were a detective," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, Every lawman in this territory would be out of a job. She felt a genuine laugh bubble up inside her, a sound she had not heard from herself in a long time. "I am a part-time detective," she quipped back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Full-time rancher." The light-hearted moment faded, and a shadow of her old fear crept back into her eyes. "So many people I trusted have—" She could not finish the sentence. The fear of being left alone again, of this new fragile trust being shattered, was a constant, aching presence. Eli saw the fear in her eyes. He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "I am not running away. Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet and sure, "I am clearing a space for you in my life." His words were not a flowery promise, but a statement of intent, as solid and dependable as the man himself. In that moment, she believed him. With Abernathy, they laid out their plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and it used their enemy's own greed as the bait. Eleanor, through Abernathy, would send a message to Thomas and Halverson. She was broken. She was ready to give up. She would agree to sell Willow Bend to them for a ridiculously low price, to avoid the public shame of a foreclosure. The only condition was that the transaction had to be immediate and private, overseen by the circuit judge himself to ensure its legality. "It is a huge risk," Abernathy warned her. "If they suspect a trap, they could retaliate in ways we cannot predict. If the judge does not see the evidence as I do, you will have willingly signed away your ranch. There will be no going back." Eleanor looked at Eli, who gave her a single, confident nod. She looked at the small ledger on the table, the proof of their crimes. Then she thought of her father, and his words about never selling your honor. "Let us set the trap," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "If it fails, I lose a ranch, but if it works, the whole territory wins a little bit of its soul back." The first sign was not a sight, but a smell. A faint, acrid scent of burning grass on the night wind. It was the smell of every rancher's worst nightmare. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. There it was, a low, angry orange glow to the north, a false and terrible dawn. The Double Hook gang had not come for her cattle tonight. They had come for her land, armed with torches. Eli was there in minutes, his face a grim mask in the flickering, distant light. "They are trying to create a diversion, draw everyone north while they do whatever they plan to do here." But the wind, that fickle and unpredictable god of the prairie, had its own ideas. It shifted, moaning through the cottonwoods, and began to blow from the north, directly toward them. The orange glow on the horizon brightened, intensified, and began to spread with terrifying speed. The fire was no longer a diversion. It was a hungry beast, and it was racing straight for Willow Bend. "Oh, there is no time to fight it head on!" Eli shouted over the rising roar. "We have to move the herd, now! The only chance is Red Canyon." It was a desperate gamble. Red Canyon, with its narrow entrance and high rock walls, was the only natural firebreak for miles. But it meant driving the entire herd, a frantic, terrified mass of animals, directly through the heart of the threatened pasture. What followed was a controlled chaos, a terrifying ballet of instinct and skill. Eli rode ahead, a phantom in the smoke-filled twilight, his voice a steady, calming presence as he guided the lead steers. Eleanor rode the flank, her horse a lathered, wild-eyed extension of her own will, her shouts sharp and clear as she kept the herd from scattering. They used the land itself as a weapon against the fire. A shallow, dry creek bed became a crude firebreak, a line in the sand against the advancing flames. They rode along the edge of the fire, using soaked blankets from their saddle rolls to beat out the smaller, stray embers that jumped the line, the sizzling sound and the smell of burning wool filling the air. They drove the herd toward a low, ancient stone wall that marked an old property line, using it to funnel the panicked animals and shield them from the worst of the heat and smoke. The air grew thick and almost unbreathable, Embers, like a swarm of angry, glowing insects, rained down around them. The roar of the fire was a constant, deafening presence, but they pushed on. Two determined figures against an apocalypse of flame, their faces black with soot, their eyes red and streaming. As they approached the narrow entrance to Red Canyon, a sense of desperate relief began to dawn. They had done it. They were going to make it. But as they rounded the final bend, the relief turned to ice in Eleanor's veins. A line of riders blocked the canyon entrance. At their head, looking calm and composed in the hellish, fire-lit landscape, was Thomas Reed. Beside him sat the hulking, brutal leader of the Double Hook Gang. They were not here to fight the fire. They were here to complete the ambush. "You have had a difficult night, Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice carrying easily in a sudden lull in the wind. He held up a piece of paper, a pen, and a small, portable inkwell. "A great tragedy. To lose your herd now would be the final blow. Sign the deed. Sign the ranch over to me, and I will let your cattle pass. Refuse, and we will hold you here while the fire takes everything." He was smiling, a look of triumphant certainty on his face. He believed he had finally won. Eleanor sat on her horse, her chest heaving as she fought for breath in the smoky air. She looked at the wall of flame behind her, at the terrified, exhausted herd, and then at the man she had once promised to marry. A strange, cold calm settled over her. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice surprisingly loud and steady, "would you be so kind as to read the final clause of this proposed agreement?" For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, from the deep shadows behind a towering rock formation to the side of the canyon, Mr. Abernathy stepped forward. He was not alone. Beside him stood the circuit judge, his face a stony mask of judicial fury. The legal trap had been sprung. Thomas's smile vanished, his face contorting in a mask of disbelief and rage. "Certainly, Miss Whitfield," Abernathy said, his voice dripping with theatrical courtesy. He took a document from his own coat. "The clause in question is the railroad indemnity clause, which would grant the new owner, in this case, Mr. Reed and his associate Mr. Halverson, a payment of 3 times the land's value from the territorial government, a payment they have attempted to secure through forgery, intimidation, and arson. The leader of the Double Hook Gang, a man who understood violence far better than legal maneuvering, saw that the plan had gone terribly wrong. With a guttural roar, he pulled his pistol from its holster. Eli reacted instantly. He spurred his horse forward, placing himself directly between the gunman and Eleanor. The gun fired, the sound a sharp crack that was almost lost in the roar of the fire. Eli cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and slumped in his saddle, his hand clutching a dark, spreading stain on his shoulder. Eleanor did not scream. She did not panic. As the rustler swung his gun toward the judge, she raised the Winchester that had been resting across her saddle. She fired once. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. It was not a hero's shot from a dime novel. It was a rancher's shot, practical and precise. The bullet did not kill the man. It struck the rock face just beside his hand, shattering the stone and sending a spray of sharp fragments into his wrist. He howled in pain, the pistol clattering uselessly to the ground. At that moment, as if from nowhere, a figure ran out from the shadows and into the charged space between the two groups. It was May Carter. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes burned with a desperate, righteous fire. "He is lying," she screamed, her voice raw and piercing. It was all him. He forged the deed. He planned everything. She held up the small, leather-bound ledger, waving it in the air for all to see. "Here is the proof." His own handwriting, payments to the Double Hook Gang. He confessed everything to me. I was a coward, and I was a fool. But I will not be a party to this anymore. I will testify to everything. As if her voice were a signal, a new sound began to build, a rumbling chorus of shouts and hoofbeats. Over the rise, a wave of people appeared. It was the town, the volunteer fire brigade with their pitifully small water wagon, ranchers and farmers with shovels and wet sacks, even Reverend Michael, his face grim with determination. They had not been diverted. They had seen the fire threatening Willow Bend, and they had come to help. The community that had judged and whispered about her was now, for the first time, standing with her. Thomas's face, illuminated by the approaching flames, was a picture of pure, pathetic desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at May. It was her idea. She manipulated me. She wrote that book to frame me. Mr. Halverson, who had been sitting on his horse at the back of the group, saw that the game was up. He quietly turned his horse, intending to slip away into the smoke and confusion, but he was too late. Two burly farmers grabbed his bridle, pulling him to a halt. The sheriff, who had arrived with the townsfolk, pushed his way through the crowd and grabbed Halverson by the collar. A small, heavy object fell from the banker's pocket and landed in the dust. It was the old, flawed bank seal. The townsfolk did not wait for instructions. They formed a line from the canyon's small, seasonal creek, a bucket brigade of grim-faced men and women, passing water hand over hand to throw against the encroaching wall of fire. Water met fire with a great hissing and steaming, and then, as if in answer to some unspoken prayer, the sky opened up. A sudden, torrential downpour began to fall, drenching the fire, the land, and the people. Nature itself seemed to be delivering its verdict, washing away the threat and cleansing the sullied ground. In the sudden, blessed quiet, amidst the steam and the rain, Eli slid from his saddle. Collapsing to the ground, Eleanor was there before he hit the dirt, sliding from her own horse and cradling his head in her lap. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. "Do not you leave me in the middle of the rainy season," she whispered, her voice choking on a sob she could no longer contain, her tears mingling with the rain on his face. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. "I cannot," he murmured, his eyes fluttering closed. "I still owe you a spring." The town hall in Silver Gulch had served as a dance hall, a church on Sundays before the new one was built, and a place for contentious town meetings. Tonight, it served as a makeshift courthouse. Lanterns were hung from the rafters, casting long, sober shadows across the plank floor. The circuit judge sat at a simple wooden table at the front of the room, his face grim and weary. The entire town seemed to be packed inside, a silent, watchful audience standing along the walls. At the front, flanked by the sheriff, sat Thomas Reed, Mr. Halvorson, and the two captured members of the Double Hook gang. Thomas stared at the floor, his handsome face a slack mask of despair. Halvorson maintained an air of indignant fury, while the two rustlers just looked sullen and trapped. The judge convened the preliminary hearing with a bang of his gavel. This was not a formal trial, he announced, but an inquiry to determine if sufficient cause existed to hold these men for the circuit court. He called Mr. Abernathy to present the case. The lawyer laid out the evidence with the precision of a watchmaker. He presented the forged deed transfer, placing it beside the legitimate bank receipt Eli had obtained. He pointed out the impossible date, the mismatched seal. He produced the small leather ledger May had provided, and as he read Thomas's own meticulous entries detailing bribes and payments for security, a low murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. He presented the threatening letter Thomas had fabricated to silence May, a clear example, he argued, of witness intimidation. He then called May Carter to the front. She walked slowly, her eyes fixed on the judge, refusing to look at Thomas. Her voice, though quiet, was steady and clear as she recounted the entire sordid affair, from Thomas's first promises to his final, cruel threat. She did not spare herself, confessing her own complicity, her own greed and fear. Her testimony was a raw, painful act of self-incrimination, and it was devastatingly effective. Finally, Abernathy called on Eli Mercer. He walked to the front with his right arm in a clean white sling, a stark reminder of the violence that had underpinned the financial scheme. He recounted the conversation he had overheard in the saloon, detailing the plan to drive Eleanor's herd into Red Canyon and make it look like an accident. He held up the black hat with the double-hook brand. His testimony was the final, undeniable link, connecting the respectable men in suits to the brutal men with guns. The chain of corruption was complete, exposed for all to see. When it was over, a profound silence filled the hall. The evidence was not just a collection of facts. It was a mirror, and in it, the community saw a reflection of its own failings. They saw their willingness to believe the worst of a woman struggling alone, their eagerness to gossip and judge, their blind deference to the authority of the bank. The first crack in that collective facade of self-righteousness came from an unexpected source, the wife of the mercantile owner. The woman who had led the charge of the auxiliary committee pushed her way through the crowd. She stood before Eleanor, her face flushed with a shame that was clearly genuine. "Miss Whitfield," she began, her voice faltering. I want to apologize. We were wrong. We should have stood by you. We were so busy worrying about what was proper, we forgot to worry about what was right." Her apology, public and unadorned, seemed to grant others permission to feel their own shame. Reverend Michael stepped forward, his expression troubled. He placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. But his words were for the entire room, and most especially for Eleanor. "Forgiveness is a matter of the heart, and that is between you and your Maker," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound humility. "But justice is a matter of the world, and we have a duty to see it done." The judge rendered his decision swiftly. Thomas Reed, Mr. Halverson, and the two rustlers were to be held without bail for the grand jury. The bank was to be sealed, its assets frozen pending a full federal investigation. He then turned his stern gaze upon May Carter. "Your testimony was crucial," he said, his voice hard. "But that does not absolve you of your role in this conspiracy." Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the silence. "Your Honor," she said, standing. Miss Carter made a terrible mistake. But in the end, she chose to tell the truth, at great personal risk. She gave me the evidence that brought this all to light. I will not be pressing any additional charges against her. The judge looked at Eleanor, a flicker of respect in his tired eyes. He considered for a moment. "Very well. In light of her cooperation, and with the victim's wishes taken into account, I sentence May Carter to 6 months of public service, to be served here in Silver Gulch, where she can work to repay the community she wronged." May stood, head bowed, and accepted her sentence with a quiet nod. She had lost her reputation, but she had been given a chance to reclaim her soul. Thomas Reed finally broke. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with ragged sobs. "I did it for the future," he choked out, his voice muffled and pathetic. "A better future for all of us?" "A future cannot be purchased with betrayal," the judge said, his voice cold and final. He banged his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." In the days that followed, a slow but steady healing began. Eli's recovery was quicker than anyone expected. The bullet, the town doctor declared, had passed cleanly through the fleshy part of his shoulder. Eleanor spent most of her time at Red Mesa, changing his bandages and reading to him from old newspapers. One afternoon, they sat together on his porch swing, the gentle motion a peaceful counterpoint to the recent chaos. He flexed his shoulder, a grimace of pain quickly replaced by a wry smile. "The doctor said the bullet grazed my ego more than it did any vital organs." "Is your ego that large?" she teased, a genuine smile lighting up her face. He looked at her, his expression warm and serious. "Just large enough to want to make a space for you in it." His good arm came around her, pulling her close. The legal matters were settled with a surprising speed. The federal investigators who descended upon the bank uncovered a web of corruption that went even deeper than they had imagined. Halverson was finished. In the wake of the bank's collapse, the ranchers and farmers, empowered by their recent victory, began to talk seriously about forming their own agricultural credit union, a bank of their own that would serve their interests, not prey on their vulnerabilities. Mr. Abernathy brought the new, legitimate inheritance papers out to Willow Bend. Eleanor signed them at her own kitchen table, the simple act of writing her name feeling like the conclusion to a long and brutal war. Willow Bend was finally, unequivocally, hers. The old, predatory loan from her father's time was declared null and void, and the new credit union board granted her a fair, long-term mortgage to help her rebuild. Her first act as the undisputed owner was to hire a team with a drilling rig. With the support and investment of several neighboring ranchers, including Eli, they began to drill a new, deep well in the center of her property, one that would tap into the deep aquifer and serve as a shared resource for the entire community during the inevitable dry seasons to come. The sound of the drilling rig was a sound of progress, of a community mending itself, of neighbors choosing cooperation over competition. Life began to return to the rhythms of the land. In the pasture, new calves, conceived in the heart of the drought, were born into a world of green grass and plentiful water. The laughter of Jedediah and the other hired hands echoed from the barn as they worked to repair the fire damage. And for the first time in a very long time, the small cabin at Willow Bend was filled not with the silence of worry, but with the warm, comforting smells of baking bread and the sound of two people talking quietly, planning a future that was no longer something to be feared, but something to be built together. The seasons turned. The scorched, blackened scars on the land from the fire were slowly covered by a determined fuzz of new green grass. The late autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the rich, sweet scent of cured hay and the earthy promise of a good harvest. The wind, which had once been a harbinger of dust and fire, now whispered of resilience, of a land that, like its people, knew how to heal. In Silver Gulch, the tone of the gossip had changed. The whispers were no longer of scandal and pity, but of respect and a certain grudging admiration. No one spoke of that poor, jilted Whitfield girl anymore. They spoke of Eleanor Whitfield, the proprietor of Willow Bend. She was a woman who had faced down the bank, the rustlers, and a prairie fire, and had come out the other side not just standing, but standing taller. The town's annual harvest market was a joyous affair. The fiddle music was lively. The trestle tables were once again laden with apple pies, and the mood was one of cautious optimism. The new agricultural credit union had a stall, its officers explaining loan terms with a transparency that was a revelation to many. People were talking about the new community reservoir, a project born from the ashes of Eleanor's fire, a symbol of their shared future. Eleanor walked through the market, not as an outcast, but as a respected member of the community. She was no longer just a rancher. She was a leader. Whether she had intended to be or not, people greeted her with a new warmth, a deference that had nothing to do with her gender and everything to do with her character. Eli watched her from across the square, a quiet pride in his eyes. He felt the weight of a small, cloth-wrapped package in his pocket. He had ridden to Cheyenne the week before, not for cattle or supplies, but for a silversmith. He had been specific in his instructions. The ring was not to be ornate or flashy. It was to be a simple, solid band of silver, as unpretentious and enduring as the land itself. And on its surface, he had asked the smith to engrave a single, tiny image, the wheel of a well, its bucket full, a symbol of faith restored, of a love that had brought life back to a dry and barren place. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft shades of lavender and rose, they sat together on the porch swing of her cabin at Willow Bend. The porch had been rebuilt, the wood new and strong beneath them. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind that needs no words to fill it. The day had been long, the work of the harvest hard, but it was a good, satisfying kind of tired. Eli finally broke the silence, his voice a little rougher than usual. He stopped the swing with his boot and turned to face her. "Eleanor," he began, his gaze steady and serious. "I cannot promise you that it will rain every year. There will be droughts, there will be hard times. The land does not make easy promises, and neither will I." He took her hand, his own calloused and warm. "But I can promise you this. When the drought comes, I will be your shelter. When the work is too hard, I will be your strength. And when your heart is heavy, I will be your comfort." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, cloth-wrapped package. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the simple silver ring. It gleamed in the fading light. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She looked from the ring to his face, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it almost hurt. She put her other hand over his, stilling him before he could speak again. Her eyes were shining with tears, but her voice was strong. "I do not need you to be my shelter, Eli," she said softly. "I have learned how to stand in the rain. I do not need you to be my strength. I have found my own... What I need..." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "What I need is someone to walk beside me, to share the work and the worry and the quiet evenings. I need you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. They leaned in and shared a kiss, not of fiery passion, but of deep, abiding love. A quiet and profound affirmation of a partnership forged in hardship and trust. As they pulled apart, a small girl from a neighboring ranch, a young niece of Eli's named Ella, who was playing in the yard, saw them and waved, a bright, innocent salute to their happiness. A few days later, they held a small celebration at Willow Bend, a harvest supper to thank the neighbors who had helped them through the fire and the rebuilding. Lanterns were strung between the cottonwood trees, and the sound of a harmonica played a soft, sweet tune. The same town gossip who had so cruelly narrated Eleanor's betrayal months before was there, sipping lemonade. She leaned over to her companion, her voice full of a newfound wonder. "Betrayed by her fiancé and her best friend," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "And the cowboy next door loved her anyway." It is the honest-to-goodness truth. At the edge of the lantern light, May Carter was serving pie, her movements quiet and efficient. It was part of her public service, and she did the work without complaint. Her face was thinner, her eyes holding a permanent sadness, but she was no longer the frightened, desperate girl she had been. She looked up, and her eyes met Eleanor's across the yard. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, Eleanor gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of friendship renewed, but of something more difficult and more profound. It was a gesture of release, an acknowledgement of the pain, and a quiet permission for them both to move on, to live their separate lives free from the poison of the past. May's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time, they were tears of gratitude, not of grief. She gave a small, trembling nod in return and went back to her work. The official wheels of justice had ground to their inevitable conclusion. The circuit court trial had been a formality. Thomas Reed and Mr. Salverson were sentenced to long terms in the territorial prison for fraud, conspiracy, and arson. The Double Hook gang was broken, its leaders imprisoned, its power over the territory shattered. In a landmark decision, the court had also ruled that the Trans-Wyoming Railroad, whose expansion had fueled the land speculation, was liable for the damages caused by the fire the rustlers had set. The compensation they were forced to pay helped to fund the new community reservoir and provided capital for the fledgling credit union. The people of Silver Gulch and the surrounding ranches were learning a powerful lesson that by standing together, they could hold even the most powerful interests to account. As the party wound down and the last of the guests departed, Eleanor and Eli stood on the porch, looking out at the moonlit fields of their joined ranches. They were not just planning a wedding, they were planning the next season. They talked of combining their herds for the spring drive, of which pastures to leave fallow, of what new crops to plant in the fertile bottomlands. Their love was not an ending, not a prize won at the end of a long struggle. It was a beginning, A conscious daily choice to build a life together. A partnership as real and as vital as the land they both loved. It was not a contract, signed and sealed. It was a promise, renewed each morning with the rising of the sun. The story of a year, Eleanor often thought, could be traced not in the turning of calendar pages, but in the level of water in a well. It had begun in the suffocating dust of the exposition, a time of quiet desperation where faith was a dry and hollow thing at the bottom of a stone shaft. The inciting incident, the night of the party, had been a cruel shattering, a betrayal that had sent her fleeing into the darkness. But that flight had become a journey. The rising action was a series of trials, each one chipping away at her despair and replacing it with a hard-won resolve. The quiet intimacy of a rainy night in the barn had been the story's midpoint, the moment the narrative shifted from one of survival to one of attack. And the climax, a terrifying confluence of fire and ambush, had not been an ending, but a crucible from which the truth was forged. The falling action in the makeshift courtroom and the final, quiet resolution of a proposal on a rebuilt porch now felt less like distinct events and more like the natural, inevitable flow of a river finding its way, at last, to the sea. The entire saga, from the first empty bucket to the final, gentle kiss, had been wound around the unshakable axis of land, water, and justice. From her porch at Willow Bend, which now felt more like the heart of a single, sprawling ranch that bled seamlessly into Red Mesa, Eleanor watched the world she had fought for. She was no longer the victim of the story, the girl acted upon by the greed and cruelty of others. She was the author of her own future. The experience had etched new lines of strength around her eyes and mouth, but it had not hardened her heart. It had, instead, taught her the profound truth of her father's greatest lesson, that a person's value is not determined by a deed, a bank ledger, or the promises of a handsome man, but by the unwavering ownership of one's own honor. Her voice, once a quiet murmur of worry, was now a clear and steady thing. A voice that other ranchers listened to at meetings for the new credit union. She was the mistress of her land. Yes, but more importantly, she was the master of her own story. Beside her, Eli Mercer stood with a quiet contentment that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long, the ghost of his lost brother, had finally receded. In fighting for Eleanor's future, he had made peace with his own past. He had transformed from a man guarding the perimeter of his own grief into a man who understood that love was not about possession, not about a dramatic rescue, but about the quiet, daily act of making space for another person in one's life. His protection was not a cage, but a shelter, offered freely, without expectation of payment. His love was not a contract to be signed, but a choice, remade every morning with the rising of the sun. The other characters in their drama were finding their own resolutions. In the town square, May Carter could be seen sweeping the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile, her sentence of public service a daily, visible act of penance. The town, having seen the full measure of her remorse and her courage, treated her not with scorn, but with a quiet, watchful respect. She had betrayed a trust, but she had also dared to speak the truth against a powerful man. Her future was an unwritten page, but for the first time she held the pen. As for Thomas Reed and Mr. Halvorson, they were footnotes, cautionary tales told by old men in the saloon. They were the personification of a systemic sickness, of an ambition that soured into corruption, and their fate in the territorial prison served as a stark reminder that a future built on the ruins of another's dignity is no future at all. The conflicts that had once seemed so insurmountable had resolved themselves, not through magic or miracle, but through human action. Eleanor's internal battle between her pride and her desperate solitude had ended in a quiet victory for self-reliance. Eli's struggle, the weight of his old loss against his capacity for a new love, had found its balance in partnership. The larger social conflicts, the casual misogyny, and the hypocritical judgments had been challenged and, in some small way, changed. The community had been forced to look in the mirror and had not liked the reflection. They were rebuilding, not just with a new reservoir and a new credit union, but with a new understanding of what it meant to be neighbors. Even nature, the silent, powerful antagonist of drought and fire, seemed to be in a state of grace. The land was healing, its bounty a reflection of the renewed hope of its people. The world of 1890 was still a harsh and unforgiving place. But here, in this small corner of the Wyoming Territory, something had shifted. The themes of the past year were written on the landscape itself. Dignity was in the straight new fences of Willow Bend. Justice was in the sealed doors of the old bank and the open, honest ledgers of the new one. Loyalty was in the quiet, steadfast presence of the man who stood beside her now. And love, she knew, was a conscious and deliberate choice, an act of profound respect, forgiveness. She had learned, was not the same as forgetting. Her quiet nod to May at the harvest supper had not erased the betrayal, but it had released them both from its prison, allowing the future to be something more than a constant echo of the past. The symbols of their journey were now a part of their daily lives. The old dry well at Willow Bend, that first emblem of her failing hope, was now capped, a silent monument to the struggle, in its place. The new community, well, with its ceaseless, steady pump, was a testament to their shared future. The memory of the fire was no longer just a trauma, but a reminder of the crucible that had tested them all and burned away the impurities, leaving only what was strong and true. The rain that followed had been an absolution, a sign of grace and rebirth, and on her finger, the simple silver ring, with its tiny, engraved well wheel, was a constant, tangible promise of that renewal, a vow to forever nurture the faith they had found in each other. The story had begun at a deliberate, measured pace, a slow burn of mounting pressure, before accelerating into the frantic, explosive climax. Now, it had settled into the warm, gentle rhythm of a life being built, day by day. The shocking revelations, the betrayal in the coal shed, May's desperate change of heart, the legal trap sprung in a fire-lit canyon, now seemed like necessary turns in the road, twists that had been essential to lead them here, to this peaceful, quiet porch. Eleanor looked at Eli, at the quiet strength in his face, and she knew the lessons of the past year were as real as the solid ground beneath her feet. She had learned that no one else had the right to set the price on her soul. She had learned that justice required not just the fire of righteous anger, but the cold, hard weight of evidence and the collective will of a community. She had learned that true love is not about being saved, but about finding a partner to walk with, side by side. And she had learned that the West, for all its harshness, for all its unforgiving realities, was a place where hope could be planted in the stoniest of soils, and, with enough courage and enough water, could be made to grow. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.